most do I know? I don't know most of your names. So, oh, good, Orange. Wait, did we do flappers in turn?
Yeah.
We did. Oh, can you get them out then? So then maybe I thought I remember us. Is it everybody not out like a plaque? Okay, perfect. I'll bring it to you. Just know it's that's not order. Alright, so please hold the hot dog. Long way. Right hand, big and hold. Big and fold on both sides. Please. Big and fold on both sides. Maybe I'm not right now. That's it too. That way, because again, you can see right now, I'm accustomed to a lot of conversations. And if somebody in front of you says something, I want them to be able to cite you by your name and not just go, oh, well, what she said. We all have names, right? Most of us. You guys don't know my real name, but. Oh. By the way, how was audio on Tuesday? Was good? Okay, so I'm using a laptop now. I need to get a mic. I have like a studio mic, but I totally misplaced the cord, so I'm looking for that. As soon as I find a cord, I'm going to get that set up too. But this one does seem to work quite well. I had somebody tell me this morning that, well, I can't hear the conversations when, you know, the ones they use. And I'm like, but, you know, so, like, that's what you're supposed to be writing anyway. So, so then just as a reminder, you need to send in, you know, notes. I don't need you to copy word for word every slide, because that's obviously, I provide that to you, but I need you to show that you watched it straight through. So I need notes to just, you know, things that you found important. You know, I obviously sidebar on almost every single slide, so I'm going to be saying some additional stuff that isn't up there. Maybe, you know, write just some of that. You don't need to send me 13 pages of like 1 page, 2 pages, whatever. Notes is fine. And then obviously your answers to the ones they use, because that's obviously where we converse and come together as a class. So that's all I need. So just as a reminder there. Same goes to you three. Talking to you. All right.
I was so confused with what was just going on. I thought you were talking to
Right now?
like the third thing.
Oh yeah, there's 3 people watching. Yeah. All right. So the early republic to the age of Jackson. This is a lecture 2 of our republic and democracy topic. So does anybody know the math off the top of their head? We're 3 weeks away from being halfway through the semester. But being that the last 2 weeks of the semester are back online, does that mean that after today, so we can help me do that, we are halfway through the in-person classes, or we have 1 more week? I know we're getting really close. Like we're literally halfway through in person because we don't have that spring break. And then being the fact that we're on Tuesday, Thursday class, we don't get any days off because we don't have a, you know, we don't fall into the Monday or Friday holiday. So I haven't like sat and done that, but like we're super, super close. I think we might be 1 week away. I think next week, after next week, we're halfway through in person. So it is flying by. I just read it just to kind of remember it's flying by. You'll have your grades for this assignment sometime this weekend. So you'll get that done pretty quick. And the reason I continue to bring this up is just because our semester is so compacted because of our lack of days off and our lack of a traditional spring break, kind of mid-semester breakup. I just want to remind you, if you start to sense an issue with your grade that you really need to get resolved, and after our second assignment, you know, that's when that's graded, that'll be a good kind of checkpoint for your grade to know, okay, I can keep this up, or I can catch up, or whatever I need to do. But if your grade isn't exactly where you need to be, just come talk. Let's figure something out. As I've said, you know, several times already, I'm positive that every single one of you guys can get an A in this class. 100% positive. every single one of you guys can get in this class, and I will help you get there. You just need to be able to obviously put in the effort, do the work for the assignments, put in the effort, and you know this problem. Like, I'll work with you, let's figure something out. So just keep that in mind. You know, we're getting closer. Third assignment's going to be due now in 10 days, whatever it is. We still have plenty of time. But you know, once you get this second grade in, you've got your attendance grades. If you haven't been following the live streams yet, I mean, you're losing points, you're hemorrhaging points. Those are 3 points that I can promise you, you're going to get to the end of the semester. You're going to be 12 points away from whatever grade is next, and you're going to really want to get there, whether it's a B or a B plus or an A minus or an A. But you'll have missed like 5 classes, and I can't help you. Whereas right now, it's still early enough that we can work with each other. So before we get started, you know, how's everybody doing? How are you? You're good? You've been better, or you're doing great?
Like emotionally or grade-wise?
How are you guys emotionally? I know we're living in the midst of like one of the most terrifying times in history.
It's unprecedented.
We're here. Yeah, but we're here, and yet here we are. How are you doing?
My best friend having a baby and asked me to do that.
Congratulations. So Savannah's best friend is having a baby, just asked her to be a godmother, to which you said, of course. Yes. Beautiful. Very cool. How's everybody doing at school? Like, how are you? Mary, your eyes just got wide. How's school? It's just stressful? How is, how's the pandemic? I have had COVID. You guys have had COVID, I'm assuming. Like, we've made it, like, right? I mean, like, we're getting there. Are a bunch of you guys like excited to get the vaccine? For those of us who haven't had COVID, I mean, like, you're not excited? Are you you don't have to share.
Oh no, it's because I work at the COVID vaccination site, and I was reading the paperwork, and it's not FDA approved. I was reading it.
What is an FDA approved?
The vaccines.
They have emergency approval. Yeah. So, but that's, it usually takes many years to get a full FDA approval because they want to do more long-term studies. But I mean, just considering the situation, it's got an emergency approval. So the FDA does approve them. It just doesn't have the full, like, we've looked at this for 10 years. We know exactly what's going to happen. We don't have time. So that's why. Yeah.
My dad just got cleared of COVID pneumonia for the second time, and now he's got the vaccine. That's
praise God. See, we're making it through. We all take different paths, but the reason I ask is, first off, God gave me big ears for a reason. You need to talk to anybody, you just don't know who to talk to. And I mean, like on campus, obviously, hopefully you've got a sibling or a parent or best friend who's always there for you. But like, you need to talk to me about anything, even if it's not in my class. Bring it on. I want to help you in any way I possibly can. And so, obviously, this is crazy. Don't get me wrong, this is nuts. It's so weird, but we're gonna make it through. I was looking up earlier today how many people have passed away with COVID. Known people. I will never ever trust China's numbers. They've been lying since the start. So the fact that for some reason they've got 1/50th the number of deaths that we do is just bogus, but whatever. Regardless, the worldwide numbers of people passing away is somewhere around 2 million or so. I mean, it's growing obviously, but it's like 2.2, 2.3 million. And it's people who have died with COVID. Not everybody has died. Very few people have actually died from COVID. It's just that COVID will so often put people over the top. But comparatively to the Spanish flu, which was the last time Americans had to wear a mask, which is the last time that schools were shut down, which is the last time that churches closed their doors, every one of those things happened. They can only estimate, but it's somewhere between 50 and 75 million people died worldwide of the Spanish flu. So by comparison, not only is it, we're still in the middle of it, of course, but not only is it right now between 2.2 million and 50 to 100, 50 to 75 million, but think of the population too. The worldwide population today, we're going to break 8 billion here in a couple of years. The time the world was at somewhere like 3 billion. So to have lost that many people, it's still only a fraction of the world's population. But again, comparing to what we are suffering through right now, it is so much smaller. And I'm not saying in any way to lessen what we're going through at all. I'm just kind of comparing the last two worldwide pandemics. Our numbers are so different for numerous factors. The prior one is technology. Microbiology in the 19 teens was literally science and microbiology was 30 years old. You know, it just begun as a worldwide, as a known and accredited and practiced science. So we obviously have 100 years on that. You know, and those scientists, which means also 100 years of information, let alone technology. Still, it was just interesting. I was looking at that earlier. So let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, special twitches in regards to anything. If you ever need to talk to me, you can come see me before class and see me after class, because all of my cell phone should be in text. You know, whatever you need, you know, I'm here. So with that said, I'm also here for you right now. Here in the Republic of Democracy today, we're going to describe the transition of democracy from the early republic to the age of Jackson. Now, I will fast forward 1 second and just say this topic specifically is what is discussed in the assignment coming up. So this is kind of like the big one, if you will. Everything else you can pull from the first, third, and fourth lectures. There's information you can use, but this right here, this is like, okay, you know, here's the topic. Let's really dive into it. Why do I have this? Oh, so I won't read this to you guys, but when I upload this, you'll have access to check it out if you want to. But I'll give you just the kind of summary very quickly. But last week, I don't remember, or excuse me, on Tuesday, I asked the class a question. So you guys were obviously watching online. I asked, are people born good or born evil? You guys remember that? Those of you watch, okay. And I love that discussion. I actually had that exact same question in world history class too. Are people born good or evil? Well, last year, I think I pulled this. I saw this article, and that is that researchers prove altruism, you know, basically meaning good-heartedness, begins in infancy. So what they did is they studied a bunch of kids, and they, you know, those children who like had the upper, mobility, basically. They can stand, they can walk, they can take things, they can put things back. And they essentially tested these kids on sharing. You know, can you share? And how likely is a child to share? And so at this study, basically, this study should warm your heart. Children love to share. It's a very natural thing. If somebody says, oh, may I have that? The kids will be like, yeah, here, take it. You know? So anyway, from the perspective of are people born good or born evil, this study wasn't unanimous. It's not like every child here was giving up their things, but it just showed that so many of them did. They just were willing to offer the apple, the toy, whatever it was that the adult was asking for. They didn't just do one of these. It's like, oh, you're asking? Then you shall receive. So like I said, if you want to just skim this, it's up there for you. Just to kind of put a period at the end of that sentence of that topic. All right, so social distance talking. So let's just kind of review real quick, especially for those of you who didn't watch the lecture on Tuesday. This will help you. Hopefully you're sitting next to somebody who did. You guys can kind of walk these answers. So just review, what are some of the characteristics of our democracy? What are some of the reasons the Articles of Confederation were inefficient? And finally, what are the 4 powers of government? In your conversation, give an example of each. We'll take 2 minutes, something like that. I'll look at like 1:15 on this clock. Social distance, talk to your neighbors. Ready, set, go. I don't want to move this too much, you guys. I'm just trying to see if I can make it a little bit closer. Maybe that'll make it a little easier for you guys. This is my hair. Hopefully that looks good. And on this, you do have to write these too. So just write, it's review, go back to your notes. Oh, right there. Right there. All right. It sounds like y'all are having some wonderful conversations. Thank you very much. I do actually have one more question to ask you, and you can just show me, give me a show of hands. Who's going to win the Super Bowl? Tampa Bay or Kansas City? So Tampa Bay. Okay, so put money on them, because that's obviously the odds are in. Kansas City. Who thinks? It's just a fun time. Who thinks the game will be canceled due to COVID? No, I'm just kidding. All right, so yeah, I think Kansas City is definitely the most.
My money's on Pepsi.
See, commercials are fun. I think that I certainly am tired of the commercials. Like, you're going to get some unique ones, I admit. I mean, like, I'm kind of tired of the fact that that's not like part of the game. Commercials. Also, I can't stand halftime shows anymore. Like, they can't get a good halftime. I don't. The Weekend, like, really? Like, that's. Bring back Aerosmith, like bring in a rock band that is
Just do another Janet Jackson. Let's go.
I don't give her another chance.
Come on, Nick.
But that was
a
Weekend. I'm just saying. So like I haven't watched the halftime show in so many years. The last one I watched it was like really into the Who. It's like, okay, there's a great rock band. I mean, it's like, yeah. All right, so just I'm in the mood, man. Get off my lawn. What are some of the characteristics of our democracy? Go ahead and shout it out. Some things about a democracy that's unique to, well, some things about our nation that's unique to democracy. We absolutely talk about this. Yes, Marilyn.
You said like how there's 3 branches of government.
3 branches of government. Something that is secondarily unique is the 2 houses, both houses and the Senate. Yes, ma'am.
Freedom to criticize.
Freedom to criticize. You can talk all the smack you want about Trump, and they will celebrate you. Just don't talk about Biden. So I'm kidding. Yeah, no, you can. We are blessedly free to speak out against our presidents, to speak out about our representatives. Hypothetically, technically, we're allowed to slander them as well, but it is lying. But that is part of the freedom of speech to say something that isn't necessarily true. What else? Characteristics that are unique to a democracy, to our democracy. We got our branches, we got our houses, we've got the ability to speak out against our government and not without fear of retribution. Guns. I've done this. But if we got rid of guns, we'd still be a democracy.
I know, it was just like a TikTok thing.
I was just laughing at the TikTok thing. I don't know why I said it out loud.
Okay.
Are we an indirect democracy?
No, see, what's the actual, so we're representative democracy, but we are also a constitutional republic. It's like, they basically mean the same thing. So the representative aspect means that yes, it is indirect, but then the constitutional aspect means that we have a founding baseline of government that must stay intact.
Oh,
And so the thing though is that we do have aspects of democracy that are direct. In other words, electing a president is indirect, but electing our congressman is direct. So yet they're still representatives. We're not a full true democracy where we don't need representatives. A government is in place just to ask us questions and we answer them. We elect these representatives, but we at least directly elect them. So again, presidents.
okay.
What else? Oh, that is a characteristic right there too. Partially direct democracy, partially indirect democracy, but total representative democracy, constitutional republic. Any other guys? Any other characteristics that are unique to our democracy?
Super entertaining.
It is super entertaining. I guess so. That's really all it's there for. Just to keep it almost boring without presidents that are having the time of their lives. All right, so what are some of the reasons the Articles of Confederation are inefficient, or were inefficient, excuse me? Past tense. Shout it out.
Very weak central government.
A very weak central government. It was actually a state-centric government. That's really what it was. It was a group of states that held the power. The federal government was really there just to execute the war. That's about it. What else? What was another weakness of the Articles of Confederation?
Didn't include the Bill of Rights.
It didn't include a Bill of Rights, although technically our Constitution didn't at first either. Those were added by the Congress as a promise to anti-federalists who otherwise would have vetoed the Constitution. What else?
Not like lack of similar currencies, like each state has its own currency.
Yeah, so it didn't specify for a singular national currency, so that because the states are the ones in charge, the states could mint their own currency. Very good, which, as we discussed on Tuesday, would have been very, very confusing. One more flaw, John.
The federal government couldn't tax the states.
Federal, beautiful, that's kind of like the big one. The federal government could not tax the states. So literally the Continental Congress would contact the states, or their representatives would go home to the states basically, and say, okay, we need money. And the states could say, well, we don't have it to give you. And there's nothing the federal government could do about it. It had to come from the states' willingness to set aside their surplus, if you will, to be spent or sent to the federal government. Did you have one?
Oh, no.
Okay. Do you have a plaque, brother? What? Plaque. Name card.
No, I don't.
I thought the name gold on both sides.
All right.
Okay. And then finally, with the four powers of government. Shout out one. Four powers of government. Implied? What does that mean?
I remember reading the powers that directly written or stated in here. It's kind of situational, or really implied for powers.
Yeah, well, it's technically supposed to be implied to the states. Yeah. So then two, another power. Reserve powers. Those are reserved for the states. Those are specifically. Third. Okay. Do we remember? Starts with a C. Concurrent. Those are powers that are both the federal government and the state governments can execute at the same time. And then it starts with no. Starts with E. Yes. Enumerated powers. If you don't know those, please, those will help you in this assignment. Go back and just check the first lecture. The slides will be up by the tonight tomorrow. All right, so George Washington, the origin of political parties. So today we only have two primary political parties, obviously, Republicans and the Democrats. We have additional minor parties, the Libertarians, the Greens, the Constitutionalists. I'm sure there are many others. We've had some additional parties that had some strength, progressives. That's no longer a party. That's like saying conservatives, to Republicans, progressives, or Republicans as well. But today we think of a lot of Democrats as progressive. And then Bull Moose, that was Teddy Roosevelt's party that almost won him the election. He ran against sitting President William Taft and came in second, lost to Woodrow Wilson. Well, when a nation was founded, there was no such thing as a political party. And the reason was pretty simple. They had founded on the idea of independence. They had founded on the idea of this particular style of constitutional government. There was no need to have different viewpoints. There were different viewpoints, but they came together with this very simple, straightforward, boxed-in, structured, foundational idea. And so parties, or what they called back then factions, started to develop in terms of the interpretation of it all. So George Washington was elected in 1789. He was the Republican idea. In other words, he was the one person who was pretty much just unanimously loved, although it wasn't totally unanimously loved. He received death threats as president of the United States. But basically, he was the one that when the country was founded, everybody knew, and the Constitution was ratified, everybody knew George Washington was going to be the first president of the United States. And he's the only president in history to be unanimously elected by the entire Electoral College. And he did so not once, but twice. The next closest is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan lost only 8 electoral votes in his 1984 re-election campaign. He lost the District of Columbia, which has never voted Republican in its history since getting electoral votes. And he lost the state of Minnesota, which was his opponent's home state. And he barely lost it too. Like, he almost won Minnesota. So that's the closest we've ever gotten. James Monroe also nearly won a unanimous election, but he ran unopposed for his re-election. Nobody was put up against him. So we can count that and say he was closer, because I think he only had 1 or 3 electoral votes against him, but he also didn't have an opponent, so it's almost not a fair comparison. Washington had opponents. And so at the time, it was very unbecoming of a candidate for any position in government, whether federal, state, or local, for a person to say they want to have that position. They had to be nominated, and they had to run from like behind the door, closed doors. It was okay. If I'm who the people want, I shall accept it. And so George Washington was extremely publicly reluctant to accept the presidency. He said time and again, "It ain't up to me. If it were up to me, I would stay retired." Because after the war, he retired, went home, worked on his farm. He basically just said consistently, "If it were up to me, I would stay retired. But if people want me, then I can't say no." Well, if people really wanted him, boom, so he becomes president. Well, the title of president developed in the Senate. And so the Senate at the time, for basically 1/2 of 1 term, the vice president played a very strong role. And the first vice president was, of course, John Adams. And he very much relished the idea of having a very strong local, position in government. The problem is, the Senate hated it. So in that first term of presidency, they basically kicked the vice president out of all Senate proceedings and said, "Yeah, we don't need you here." And he essentially became the least powerful person in government. George Washington kicked him out of cabinet meetings. He wasn't considered a part of the cabinet. You can see Washington's first cabinet. There were 6 people, John Adams being one of them, but the position was just so you're only there in the event that George Washington croaks over and dies. They would kick him out of cabinet meetings. He was kicked out of the Senate. He wasn't allowed to take daily part in it. And so one of the things, though, that they did in the Senate that first term that John Adams did have a small role in, that was titling the president. So of course they came up with the title of Mr. President, but here are a few of the literal options that were brought forth. Your Highness. Well, remember, they come from a monarchy, and we should recognize the President of the United States is a lowercase k king. That was the job, that was the design of the presidency, to be a lowercase k king. I say lowercase because an uppercase k king is basically a dictator. A lowercase k king is not necessarily, he's not a dictator, but he can, as an individual person, he or she can, really kind of just push and guide the government in the direction they want. And today, with executive orders, as we heard on the conversation we had on Tuesday, that really, the title of dictator is coming. Honestly, I don't know at what point, but the lowercase k is slowly morphing into an uppercase k. But regardless, other options were Your Highness, Your Most Benign Highness. This one was John Adams's. His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. Imagine, it could have been the title of the President. We could say, Joe Biden, His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. Or I guess he would have said, His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same, Joe Biden. His Exalted Highness, His Elective Highness, Most Illustrious and Excellent President, and His Majesty the President. Unfortunately, they settled on the very simple and straightforward Mr. President. His cabinet was, of course, only 6 people. Today, the president's cabinet is close to 30, because they've got, maybe it's 28, because there's 27 cabinet members, all the secretaries of, and then the vice president plays a much more day-to-day bigger, the vice president has a day-to-day role with the president. And then now the president calls upon the joint chiefs. Those are the military leaders, and they all come together and have meetings as well. So he's the president now that he calls on a number of people, more than just the original 6. And kind of the things that Washington left indelible marks on the office were 2 terms. Presidents, up until FDR, no president served more than 2 terms, because the idea was if 2 terms was enough for George Washington, 2 terms is enough for me. Of course, FDR ran for and won 4 terms, to which the Congress and states came together and said, no, 2 terms is enough, and that's when they added in the constitutional amendment to prevent the president from running for more than 2. And then he also brought unity among Americans. I mean, this was still a time where the southern states and the northern states were very different. We'll get into sectionalism here a little bit today in more future weeks. But Washington brought everybody together, because it was George Washington, just was that, again, unanimously elected twice.
He was illustrious and excellent.
He was illustrious, he was excellent, he was benign, he was all of the above. So political parties developed. Washington to this day remains the only non-affiliated, non-party affiliated president in history. He is the only true independent president, at least in terms of party. He was part of none, and he hated them. We're going to get into this here. He hated parties. He thought parties were evil and terrible for democracy. He just thought, forget parties, forget factioning, forget sectionalism, forget these different things. Come together for the betterment of America, and whatever ideas we bring forth as a group, those are the ideas that we need to move with. Instead, parties developed against his wishes. So the original political parties, the Federalists, who are quasi-modern Democrats, I say quasi because back then they were essentially laissez-faire economic, very small government in terms of that direction. And then Antifeminists, which are also modern-day Republicans, the smaller government. So the leader of the Democrats, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams as well. Thomas Jefferson was a very small government president and government leader. I'm not going to get into this, you'll have this, but that's kind of the best way to look at these 2 parties. Federalists are modern-day Democrats, and Anti-Federalists are modern-day Republicans. Stronger government, more centralized government versus smaller federal government and more power to the states. Also, the last time, I think I discussed it with you, I'll just bring it fast. The last time the United States had 0 debt, like today, I looked it up in my first class, the United States is over $27 trillion in debt. The last time the United States had 0 debt was under Thomas Jefferson. He paid off all the war debt, he paid off all the federal debt, and he gave the federal government a surplus for the last time in American history. We haven't been there since. So contemplate this too. The United States reached $1 trillion of debt, total debt, for the first time in the nation's history in 1980. So it took from Thomas Jefferson to 1980 for the country to reach $1 trillion of debt. And Ronald Reagan, his first speech conference, what is that called? What am I saying? State of the Union, thank you. And his first State of the Union said, "This is horrible. How could we possibly $1 trillion? That number shouldn't even exist." It's we're at 27 trillion today. So it took from like 1803 to 1980 to get to 1 trillion. It's taken us from 1980 to 2021 to get to 27 trillion. And we now are, because of COVID, we're averaging like 1 trillion every 3 months. So it's now what took us almost 200 years to get to, we now do it in just a couple of months. We can blame COVID, which is fair, but still. So on political parties, Washington said, quote, "However political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reign of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion." So Washington is saying, however often that a political party might actually reach us to a good end, to a solution, in the end, the people who will rise to the top of those political parties will be able to usurp the power of the voting people in America, and in the end, destroy the government by utilizing the power of the party. I just told you what George Washington was warning against. Do you think that this is still true in America today? And why? Social justice have been ever since. That's it, go.
I wonder what that sounds for you.
Show me out here.
Sorry.
Have you spoken up?
I would definitely agree.
Like people are using
It just sort of wasn't to be actually literally
Oh, righty then. Great job, everybody. So let's start with this. Show of hands. who thinks that political parties are, so the question will be, you have a second to think about it. Are political parties good for the country or political parties bad for the country? Now, we're not speaking to is the Republican and Democrat Party of the country. We're just talking in general. Are organizing by party bad for the country or good for the country? So, first half, are political parties good for the country? Yes. Maybe, actually, Savannah might have just put us over the top of her halfway. So then, are political parties bad for the country? This is a very sectional issue. We got people, nobody in the back said bad. Why bad? You guys both said bad. It's like, what is your?
I just think that I don't think political parties could ever like be taken away now. Like I think they've been around for too long and the history is too deep, so they will be around. But I think that if like we could go back and never create them, then I think there would like be a lot like there's so much, especially right now, so much tension between parties and like pinning people against each other, and like some people can like hear what party someone is and like automatically like be like, oh, I don't like them. That's not for them. Yeah. So I think it could just open up and then like people could just run for president and just say what their ideas are, and like as a citizen you can be like, okay, I like those or I don't like those. Yeah. And not have to like be forced into this like funnel of one way or the other.
Very good. So, Samantha?
And to add on to that, I think it's also like it takes away to George Washington's like original idea of what he wanted America to look like, because the parties like don't promote unity; they promote separation and people's beliefs and stuff. And like it's always one party against the other instead of like what can we do as a country to make the country better. And it's always about like what can we make our party better. Our party like stand out, what can we do to get our party in office, things like that.
Beautiful. That response was as beautiful as your mess. Very good. No, I think that's fantastic. So yeah, political parties kind of inherently are not unifiers; they are disunifiers. You know, they just inherently place a portion of the country in a box of, well, you're not one of us, and yet here we are. We're all American. So, you know, regardless of what party we belong to, that should be our ultimate goal is the success and growth and strength and you know, of our country and then of course of the individual. Nancy, are you a yes or no?
No.
You're also no. Okay.
Because I think that, for example, I think it promotes unoriginal thoughts. Candidates, and what I mean by that is that people can sit there and say, oh, I agree with all these things on this platform of said party, and they don't actually believe those things at all. They're just trying to get elected. And that's like what it goes back to what Washington was saying, that they're trying to usurp the power of the people, and they don't care about the people at all. They just want the power.
Yeah.
And it's very easy for them to do that with the parties, I feel like.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's fantastic what you do. It's not just unoriginal thought, but as you illustrated, though, it also means unoriginal candidates. You know, the last time we had a kind of a new form of, I don't want to necessarily say independent presidential candidate, but I'll kind of frame it in that context. That was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the first conservative president in history. The first conservative to run for president was Barry Goldwater back in 1964, Arizona senator at the time. But the first to be elected was Reagan. And he believed that his conservative ideals, or that the conservative ideals, were universal, that, you know, Republicans and Democrats, it should appeal to everybody. It was, you know, pro-America, obviously, but it was also pro-individual. It was low taxes, it was low regulation, it was government to just kind of stay out, let you do your thing. It was, you know, and on and on and on and on. And he, as I said, he won his re-election, losing only, I think it was 8 electoral votes. It was like 453 to 8. And he won his first election in nearly as equally as big a landslide. But I think Carter in 1980 won like 3 states, whereas Mondale in 84 won 1. Since then, I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was Reagan's vice president, he won a majority of the states. He won a large landslide, but the nation got a little bit more polarized. Then since Clinton, we're very much split in half, and there hasn't been a unifying president. Barack Obama won 2 very large elections, but he by no means won a landslide, certainly not a Reagan-esque levels. And actually how presidents used to be, I mean, Reagan was the last president to win like 45 plus states, and he did it twice. But Nixon did it before him twice. FDR did it before him 3 out of the 4 elections. Dwight Eisenhower did it. So presidents used to be able to appeal to everybody. Now they don't. I mean, we don't, because, and I think to both of your points, that it very much is because there's no original thought for the most part. It is very much just, follow the party line, follow the party line. I think what was so successful for Trump was that nobody knew what he was thinking. Well, granted, everybody knew what he was thinking. I need to take it because he never held anything. But he was still kind of seen as this like wild card in most instances. And so that was very intriguing to people because he didn't fit in very, as far as Republicans he didn't fit into that mold very well. Look at how many Republicans hated him, so that was kind of a benefit for him. It obviously wasn't meant to too. Okay, so who said yes, the political parties are positives? There were a bunch of you. Mary, like what, why are political parties positives?
I think just because, I mean, the political parties are very, I don't think where they're at right now is good. I think that they're too separated kind of in the sense where they're making each other too much. But I think that without political parties, we might kind of all get too much of like the whole like same like similar idea, and it might kind of like shift away from democracy a little bit. I think that opposing opinions are good, just not like as extreme as they are right now.
So if we didn't have political parties, it would be a lot easier for one person to kind of take control in a way, and it would be easier for a dictator to develop because there would be so much unified thought.
That's what I would think.
I think it's a very profound idea, Nate.
I agree with what Mary just said about that. I feel like political parties, if done, I want to say it correctly, if they were done correctly, there would kind of be a little bit more sensitivity to like get both sides and get both views on things and try and figure out a common goal or solution to figure out that issue. That'll kind of help to a degree. I think kind of with no political parties whatsoever, aside from like one person could take all the power from it, it's sort of like feel like too many different ideas could rise up and there won't be really any common, like there won't be any sense of like coming together. Because like if there's too many things at once, nobody can really choose, and there won't be you can't really get that much favor for one idea. So
that's a very fascinating idea. So political parties kind of inherently funnel down enough of the ideas that we can still support one party because we accept at least most of what their platform is, whereas if we didn't have those political parties, we'd have a million different parties because we'd have like a million different candidates with all these variances, and then we wouldn't have any unity. Yeah. You agree?
I do what they're saying. I feel like it also just allows us to have respect for what everyone opposing party is, and like still hear what they have to say instead of automatically scolding at them because their view is different. And I feel like in today's time at where we are, if we know someone that doesn't have the same political views as us, we will look at them differently. And it's like we don't choose our friends because they have the same views as us. You should still respect that person. At the end of the day, no matter what their view is, I may like purple and you may like blue. So I don't care because I still respect you.
So political parties, when done right, will actually teach us respect. It's just that right now we could give a damn about respect because it's my ideas or bust.
So if we can come to where there's a common ground, like maybe things will go about much better, even if there is a different person. So
if we could more come to a common good, then things would get better. We need some sort of unifying kind of force for everybody, regardless of who's in office. Unfortunately, I wonder if that unifying, you figure that like something like COVID might have been that, but it wasn't. I mean, 350,000 dead or more maybe, and we still aren't unified. But I do wonder if it would take some sort of traumatic, historic event of some major trauma that really means that people have to die kind of thing. Like, what would be that unifying event? Aliens coming to Earth, maybe, or China nuking LA or something.
Do you know what?
I just picked LA randomly, so California is.
Do you know?
I wasn't gonna say El Paso.
It's fine, it's fine.
Feeling El Paso.
It's fine.
California literally knew their own state of it. I feel like.
Yeah. Do you know what Watchmen is?
Yes, I am.
That's like exactly what you just described.
Okay, so I know the story. What do you mean though?
Like you said.
Oh, that was the unifying event at the end. Yeah. Well, that was also Pearl Harbor. That was also which lasted 4 years. That was also 9/11, which lasted for about 4 hours. That's hyperbolic. The country was unified after 9/11. You guys, I don't know if anybody was born, certainly even if you were born, you were old enough to remember it. The country was unified. The night of 9/11, Congress came out of the Capitol, stood on the steps of the Capitol, and sung God Bless America holding hands. They were unified. The country, George Bush's approval rating skyrocketed. The country was unified. He was celebrating, was cheered when he walked out of the field to throw out the first pitch of Game 3 of the World Series in New York. Standing ovation for a state that hasn't voted Republican since 84, maybe 88. So if we were unified, and then what disunified us was the question of what to do next. We're unified, we were attacked, we were hit, we need to do something. And as soon as I was, okay, we've got an idea to do it, well, that idea sucks, boom, we reverted back to our apparently natural state of Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans hate Democrats and vice versa. So Washington's early distrust of political parties came because he believed that the rich felt, well, and I shouldn't say he believed, the rich did feel like they were obligated to rule as a civic duty and believed that they promoted the interests of everyone. Well, obviously, if the rich are the ones that have control, then not everybody has an opportunity. Thus, what he was afraid of, what a lot of them were afraid of, was oligarchy of just the wealthy were going to gain power. In the beginning, that was true. It was just kind of like, that's how it happened. But it also, the reason we have a Senate and a House, there are multiple reasons. But in terms of how they were set up, the Senate was supposed to be oligarchy. That was supposed to be wealthy. They're for 6 years because they can afford to be gone from their homes and businesses for a long time because they've got that wealth built up. The House is only 2 years. They are supposed to be the farmers, the kind of the working class Americans. They go in for 2 years, maybe they get a second term, and then they're leave, go home. They kind of had they let their voice be heard. They kind of helped to fix the issues that were facing them, at a local level, and boom, they were done. So in essence, there was supposed to be oligarchy, but he was really afraid that was all that was going to be power. What was the point? Now we just have another monarchy in parliament. At the time, property holding requirements for voting and office holding, at the time there was property holding requirements for voting and office holding. You had to be a property owner in order to participate in vote. There was a carryover from the English system, but that evolved very quickly. We'll get into it here. Politics was not a profession. So there were small salaries attached to it. Today it's absolutely a profession. People try to run for office and hold it forever. It was within the last 10 years, the first time in American history, the average career in Washington, D.C. broke 10 years, which meant that even in the House, you were more likely, if elected once, to win 5 elections than you were to lose any time in that interim. Parties were obviously distressed. They were called factions. Washington was the first to distress them. James Madison defined a faction, quote, as citizens united by a common interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or the community's interest, which is what most of you guys illustrated there a moment ago in your conversation. President Washington warned against the rise of political parties because he said they inflamed the public passion and potentially let foreign powers exert influence over us. What was said about Trump 4 years ago is that, oh, Russia, I think it's all bogus, regardless. I mean, right there's at least an example of people thinking that potentially could happen here in 2016 versus 1870, 1881. And there was no concept of the party as being a regular and necessary instrument to organize citizens' views and to express them. It truly was supposed to be local or regional, and it truly was supposed to be America first. And so that was the goal. So why have a faction? Why have a party? It's supposed to be the House members representing their neighbors. Their neighbors, literally, it's supposed to be senators representing their state. And that was it. And every one of them, when elected, were not supposed to, be a part of some group of, regional elected officials. It was supposed to be, we're here to represent the country. We have our local problems, we have our state-based regional problems. Now let's bring them all together and fix them as a country. So the first part is, like I said, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, also known, the Anti-Federalists led by Jefferson, was also known as the Democratic Republicans. In Washington's farewell address, he said, "The common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain." So he's pointing out that political parties were causing problems even back then, and that the wise people of this country should get rid of them to be able, or should discourage them or restrain them altogether. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies, as you guys have all illustrated here, and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Well, we've already discussed this, so I'll skip this. Do political parties hurt the political process? And do they create more problems than they resolve? Well, let's just answer them kind of as a whole. Do political parties hurt the political process? Yeah, raise your hand, please. You guys say this. Andrew, just real quick, what are you saying, Kyle?
There are pros and cons to political parties in general.
As we just illustrated here, yeah, beautiful. So then, do political parties cause or create more problems than they resolve? Raise your hand if you agree. Yeah. Oh, sorry, you're saying it's okay, it's not very cool. Why do they create more problems than they resolve?
I don't know, I just feel like it's just a lot of talk.
It's a lot of talk,
Yeah.
not a lot of action?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's
It's kind of like the saying, actions speaking louder than words.
actions speak louder than words. Very good. You guys ever heard the phrase, if progress is the opposite of if pro is the opposite of con, why is progress the opposite of cons? If pro is the opposite of con, why is progress the opposite of cons? Then again, I will argue that Congress was supposed to be a deliberative body. The point was that it was going to take time because they were going to debate and argue and come to a well thought out conclusion, consensus. The problem was that that really makes most sense when both sides are trying to come to a conclusion. When one party is strictly attempting to disrupt or distract or completely knock off the rails the other, then you're never going to get anything. All right, so president number 2. Juan Adams. So just a couple of kind of highlights from his presidency. Of course, he too was a federal. So, I didn't say George Washington was the only independent president in history because he never affiliated himself with a party, but he most closely aligned with the Federalists, and it was well known he knew it too. He just refused to call himself a Federalist because his perspective was Okay, sure, I agree with them, but those are still the unifying American ideals. So 8 years of air quote Federalist George Washington led then into 4 years of true Federalist John Adams. So some of those highlights were the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. The Alien Act allows the president to expel foreigners from the United States if the president believes they are dangerous to the nation's peace and safety. So that is, expulsion. That is, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Not exile, but regardless. And the Sedition Act barred American citizens from, now this is the beautiful one right here, barred American citizens from saying, writing, or publishing false, scandalous, or malicious statements against the United States government, Congress, or the president. You were not allowed to lie about the government, is what this law said. This was passed by the Federalists in both the House, in the Senate, and then signed by the president to become law. That you are not allowed to lie about government. Okay, that's fair. Don't lie about government paper, but who decides it's a lie? That's the ultimate question. That's the moral baseline. Sure, they can say, quit lying about us, but wait a second. What if you're calling them liars and now you can use this power to shut them up? So that was the fear. And that ended up getting him in a lot of trouble. So he is a well-liked president, but not well-liked enough to win re-election. And so for the first time in history, we have a peaceful transition of power between parties. And this was watched by the world round because Thomas Jefferson was a very popular potential president. So we have the election of 1800 after Adams' first term. The Federalists put forth Adams and Vice President Pinckney. The Republicans, or Democrat Republicans, put up Jefferson and Burr. And like I said, this was the first peaceful transition of power because after 12 years of Federalist power in both the Congress and the presidency, the nation went a different way. And they elected a small government states' rights faction of politicians led by Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson won pretty handily, 73 electoral votes to Adams' 65, 53% of the vote to Adams' 47. 6 points is always a pretty good margin and nationally. And Thomas Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800. Now it's a kind of pompous thing, hey, you elected me up, it's a revolution. Well, it kind of was, and it really led into it kind of gives us a possible answer to the question of when did the American Revolution actually end? Do I ask this question or just ask it? Okay, so I asked this philosophically, so I'll just ask it philosophically, you don't have to have an answer. But think of this question, when did the American Revolution end? Did it end when the war ended? So when hostilities ended in 1787? I think it was 1787. Did it end with the Peace of Paris in 1789, which is when the formal war ended and everything was signed? Did it end with the ratification of the Constitution, the first of its kind in history, in 1791 to 1790? Did it end with Thomas Jefferson's election in 1800, as he called it, because it was the first time in human history where the people changed the form of the government from, in this case, from Federalists, from federal government heavy, to anti-federalist, democratic Republicans, just state-centered. Or, option number 5, has the revolution never ended? Is the idea that the war ended, that we had a constitution developed, that went brand new over the world, first the world ever saw, that we had our first transition of power, peaceful transition of power, and there was no bloodshed. We kicked out a government. They kicked out the John Adams government, said, be gone, we're installing a new one. No single drop of blood was lost. Or is it still going to this day? Because we do that very thing every 4 to 8 years. Think about it. Joe Biden is the exact opposite of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the exact opposite of Barack Obama. Barack Obama is almost the exact opposite of George W. Bush. George W. Bush is almost the exact opposite of Bill Clinton, who was the exact opposite of George Herbert Walker Bush. we change our government and thus the course of the nation every 4 to 8 years. In essence, miniature revolutions. So has the American Revolution ever ended? Thomas Jefferson called 1800 the Revolution of 1800, or Thomas Jefferson called his election the Revolution of 1800. And so we looked at him real quick. He was a Republican agrarianist, meaning that Republican, again, small government is what that references. The Republican Party doesn't exist for another 50 years. But small government and pro-farming. He was very much the nation needed to focus on farming for some very specific reasons. And he said on farmers, quote, those who labor in the earth, the yeoman farmers, are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people. And the reason for this was very simple, because these people, a yeoman farmer is someone who farms for his family's well-being. He toils the earth, he grows the food, he grows the crops, he raises the chickens and the cows and whatever, so that he can feed his family and they can survive. Thus, they know work, they know hard work, they know stability, they know self-control, they know choosing one's path. They know that if they fail, that their family fails, therefore they must work. That was wisdom in Thomas Jefferson's mind. And let's kind of take the past and make the present, is a person at any level who works their whole lives and knows the value of hard work, knows the value of saving, knows that everything they do can potentially alter the life of their family. Are they not technically more wise than the person who doesn't? Whether it's the person who was born into money and never had to work their whole lives, or the person who lives on welfare and never has to work their whole life and has everything given to them, is the person who is the hard worker, the toiler, the all of that, the above, everything I just said. Are they not more wise, or are they, than a person who's never had to work, whether it's due to wealth or handouts? Thomas Jefferson would have said, the people that work. So Jefferson and the other Anti-Federalists believed that these young farmers nurtured a spirit of self-reliance that made economic and therefore genuine political independence possible. And what does he mean by that? Think about this. The person who lives on a handout, what are they going to continue to vote for? Are they going to continue to vote, or what are they going to vote? Are they going to vote for the continuance of those handouts? They don't have to work? Or are they going to vote to cut those off, forcing them to go to work and work hard? And so he is saying, if we are all working hard, we are basing our lives on this idea of self-reliance and not reliance on others, then therefore that leads to both political and genuine independence. If you're waiting for your checks, are you independent? No, you are wholly dependent on what others are going to give you. And so, as Jefferson said, those yeoman farmers, those who labor in the earth, are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people. So in his 8 years as president, Washington won 2 terms, Jefferson Adams 1, Jefferson 2. He reduced the size and cost of the federal government. This is the last time the United States had no national debt in our history. He repealed those federalist legislation that made John Adams so disliked by the end, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts. He maintained international peace, although he was also the first president to have a Congress declare war. First time he declared war against Muslim pirates off the coast of Europe. Jefferson needed the full cooperation of congressional Republican leaders, and he got it. He established close ties with the leaders of both houses of Congress, and while he seldom announced his plans on Twitter, which would have made him a very boring person to follow, sent on Twitter, he seldom announced his plans in public, which would have made him a very boring person to follow on Twitter. He did make certain that his legislative lieutenants knew exactly what he desired, which gave them a course to plot a path to get to the means, to get the ends of his means. So, for instance, if he said, we will pay off the debt, his people, his staff, the secretaries of, and the congressional leaders knew, we got to pay off this debt. That's what our president wants, we got to make this thing happen. I only wish the current president would say the same thing. And then, I'm sure they could say it, but congressional leaders would just laugh in my face. I then wish our congressional leaders would say, yeah, okay, we're gonna do that. Mr. Orban. His other great accomplishment was the acquisition, is the Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of Louisiana, the Port of New Orleans, up, as you can see, even into modern day Canada. He purchased it from the French in 1803 for $15 million. The purchase secured American control of the Mississippi River. It had been under French control as well, and doubled the size, as you can see, of the nation in one fell swoop. It would almost, at this point, be like the United States purchasing Canada in terms of relative size and scope, in terms of that, thus doubling the size of the American land.
How much did that cost?
15 million.
Okay.
Yeah. So 15 million then, but we're probably talking 100 million, somewhere, maybe even more, 150 million today. But which, to them, that 15 million meant a lot more because our GDP was much smaller. But today, 150 million, 150 billion would be a drop in the budget. 150 billion, maybe not, but to buy that much land, yeah, it really would be like, hey, sign this. That's like finding some great item at an antique store. It still might be $150, but you just know it's worth a lot more anyway. Also, during this presidency, the independent judiciary, that is the Supreme Court, made itself, it formalized itself. So we had the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, in which the Supreme Court asserted itself the power of judicial review for the first time by declaring an act of Congress, the Judiciary Act of 1789, unconstitutional. So that solidified the power of the Supreme Court as an equal branch of government. Which was obviously important. The three branches were designed to be equal in power and scope. The question was, what exactly does the Supreme Court do to check and balance the other two branches? Well, that showed we can do this. We can declare a current law unconstitutional and thereby strike it off the books. And by doing that, they assert themselves as an equal branch with equal power and thus a check or balance on the other two. So, and that's what they do today. The Supreme Court doesn't really rule cases unconstitutional quite regularly. They traditionally just kind of clarify what laws are. They don't necessarily check laws off the books very often, but they can. One big one that did get checked off, and a lot of people were hoping was that of Obamacare. The Supreme Court could have literally taken that. It's like, 1,500-page law? They could have struck that 1,500-page law down and said, nope, every word of this is unconstitutional. Instead, what they chose to do was interpret it, where they kept the law, but then they just said, well, it means this in a constitutional sense, so therefore the law remained, but they interpreted what that law really meant for the nation. So that would have been a really big one, probably would have been possibly the biggest law to ever be deemed unconstitutional, and they chose not to. All right, so at this time, how are people elected? How are modern presidents elected today? Modern candidates for president, elected today. Go ahead and shout out. How are they nominated? Presidential candidates, how are they nominated?
Primary.
Primaries. Via who? Who runs the primaries? I heard a voice. Who runs the primaries? Who is voting? Yeah. Okay, well, so good. About half of you guys are voting. So how did you vote for president? What did you do? Did you vote for president nomination? John?
I filled in the bubble.
It's a very specific and accurate answer. Yes. So so they're nominated, but by whom? Officially.
Isn't it the presidential party?
The party, yes, so political party nominates them. So that is the answer. Party nominations. So therefore, the Democrats will put forth their candidate, the Republicans will put forth their candidate, the Libertarians will do the same, Green Party. We don't need to care about them, but whatever. The So, however, that's a more recent system. It's not even 40 years old. How they used to nominate presidential candidates was first the King Caucus system from 1800 to 1828, and the convention system from 1832 to 1972. So let's check this out. So the King Caucus system was that members of Congress met to nominate presidential candidates from their party, subverting the American public. That was it. Congress came together and said, we're going to nominate them. And it's actually how James Monroe was able to run unopposed for his re-election. There were two parties. There were air quote Democrat, air quote Republicans. We'll just stick with that. He was a Democrat. The air quote Republicans at the time, which really the Whigs, were just so kind of dysfunctional that they didn't have anybody to put forth. So Congress, the congressional delegates there, failed to put forth anybody. So James Monroe just ran along. Who is advantaged in this system? Who holds the advantage in the system? King Caucus. John? The congressmen. They hold a lot of power, so they can decide who our presidents. So therefore, who is disadvantaged in the system? The people. We don't have a voice at any level. If you think about it, at least in this current system, we get a voice in nominating because it's a vote. What will happen is that for the Republican primary, each state, now it dwindles the longer the states go, because it starts in some states and then, moves. I think it's a very inefficient system, just as what they do. Regardless, each state will get a ballot. So Republicans will get a ballot. We'll have like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 candidates, all Republican. That we then vote for, like John said, fill out a bubble, connect an arrow line, which we do in Arizona. And then we say, that's what we want to party. Before, in the King Caucus system, we didn't have, the people had no voice. It was just like, okay, well, I guess our candidates are James Monroe and Wagner, because that's it. And did we have a choice? Nope. We got to choose James Monroe. So Benjamin Austin, who was a Massachusetts Republican, said of this system, quote, if anything will arouse the freedmen of America, it must be the arrogance of a number of members of Congress to assemble as an electioneering caucus to control the citizens in their own rights. Is there any paragraph in the Constitution which gives them, Congress, such an authority or even countenances such a proceeding? After Congress have accomplished their legislative business, have they a right to dictate in the choice of an executive? It's obviously not all light even back then. So then let's look at the party convention system. So the elements of the convention system were that regional party bosses controlled the delegates. So there are a series of delegates that a party put forward. So we'll just take the Democrats. They would put forward these delegates from each state. So each state had a number of delegates who would help decide who the party nominated. Then party bosses would then control those delegates and tell the delegates who was going to, who they should vote for. So the conventions nominated candidates. So this is then how we got to the convention system. So we still have conventions, but really all the conventions now are just kind of parties to, when I say party, I mean like, drinks and balloons kinds of parties to celebrate the political party. It's like a 3-day, let's go Republican kind of party, or a 3-day, let's go Democrat kind of party. Well, the conventions back then, they actually played the role in who was going to be nominated for that party. So what this meant, though, is that candidates were subservient to the party based on the party bosses were the ones who actually kind of controlled who was going to be nominated. There was mass partition of parties, and actually I should say there's mass participation of parties, but there also particularly mass participation in these conventions. And at these conventions, many ballots were cast to nominate a presidential candidate. Literally, in some cases, over 100 ballots, and these votes could go on for 36 straight hours. This is not exaggeration. Voting could last several days. Delegate leaders for certain candidates would throw their delegates' votes behind other candidates. So in other words, if I was a party boss and I had, say, 12 delegates, with me, I would tell them who to vote for. And if, let's say, we wanted, Donald Trump in this system, but he was going up against Cruz, Ted Cruz, we might have our votes initially for Ted Cruz, knowing that we strategically want to get Trump in, be nominated. So what we'd do is by throwing our votes behind Cruz at first, we were hurting other candidates. And as we hurt other candidates, they would drop out, or they'd be forced to drop out. We can rush our votes over Trump. And so several party bosses would do that. They would suddenly pull their votes from Cruz, throw them towards Trump, and it would go to the top. So it was very complicated. It was very, very strategic. It was very, very political. Trump was a lot of fun. So then patronage obviously led to political party nepotism. In other words, I'll get you one second. In other words, essentially, so what I would do as a party boss maybe is I would tell Trump, okay, I'll get my guys to you at the last second, we'll put you over the top. But you gotta do me a favor if I do this, because I can keep my guys to voting for Cruz. If we get you over the top, you gotta make me Secretary of State. Or let's say I had somebody else out, you gotta make so-and-so Secretary of State. You gotta make them Secretary of the Treasury. You gotta make them Secretary of Transportation. You gotta give them a big position. And those candidates would then be forced to say, okay, so I gotta make so-and-so Secretary of Treasury, so-and-so Secretary of State, so-and-so Assistant Director of the Navy, blah, 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 also that they can get those delegates to vote more.
Did they do this with like public office too?
This was basically just president.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I can't remember where I was reading it, but I was reading this kind of like a spoof book, I think, on like the presidents, and it was talking about like Chester A. Arthur and like the Tammany Hall stuff and all that. And it sounded a whole lot like this whenever they were like electing sheriffs and stuff.
Well, there was some of the stuff on a local level. You probably have to go through a party boss. Take JFK's election as, I think it was his first House position, his first House vote election. His family was well liked. The party bosses, there was in this district he was running, there was a guy that was very well liked as well, and then it was the incumbent. But the party bosses really liked his family, really wanted to put JFK in. So what they did was they actually found another John Kennedy living in the district, some random guy. They got him on the ballot. No, excuse me, it wasn't they got another John Kennedy. They got another guy with the name of JFK's opponent. That's what it was. And they got him on the ballot. So let's say his name was Adam Maines. So now there are two Adam Mainses on the ballot. People didn't know which one to vote for. So it split the vote, which pushed JFK over the top to win his first House seat. And so those were, so that was on a local level, but there wasn't a convention system there. That was just the Kennedys worked with the Democrat Party, and the Democrat Party really screwed with the other candidate to split that vote and put JFK up top.
Okay.
So there was a lot of electioneering, a lot of politicking. That's still stuff kind of, you can't do that anymore really, but stuff does happen behind the scenes. But traditionally, the big stuff really was the president.
Okay.
So there were a couple of contested conventions, and there were several, in which nobody really knew who the candidate was going to be up top. I wanted to show you one of these really quickly.
Next week in Philadelphia are really continuation along American tradition. Ever since the 1800s, parties have convened ahead of each presidential election. But the role of the conventions has changed quite a bit over the years.
Conventions are really a big infomercial for the party.
An infomercial with dance breaks and colorful attire.
It's a chance for the party to show what it's all about and what it wants to be about. It's highly scripted, very programmed.
And yet it wasn't always that way. In generations past, these were the places presidential hopefuls won or lost their bids.
It used to happen that a very small number of party leaders could have a tremendous amount of influence about who the national ticket was.
Those party leaders gathered in a smoke-filled room, a phrase a reporter coined in the 1920 Republican convention, describing a late-night meeting that resulted in the nomination of Warren Harding. In those days, the voting process was tedious at times. Democrats in 1924 cast more than 100 ballots over 16 days before settling on a nominee.
No party today would want to have the semblance or, in fact, reality of such disunity before a national television audience.
Prior to Franklin Roosevelt, candidates didn't even show up to accept their nominations in person. They considered it too aggressive.
back to George Washington, the great tradition was of the reluctant candidate. You know, this office is too noble for the likes of me, but if the people were to choose me, I would out of a sense of duty, serve.
But politicians eventually started campaigning for their party's support. And by the mid-20th century, a handful of states allowed voters to have a say.
Well, man, I tell you, I hope Mr. Taft, because I think he's the best qualified man in the country for the job.
But the delegates they sent to the convention didn't hold much sway. In 1952, 15 states held Democratic primaries, and Estes Kefauver won almost all of them. But he still lost the nomination to Adlai Stevenson, who hadn't entered a single one. Things changed, however, after the tumultuous 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Protesters fought with police outside the convention hall, while inside,
I proudly accept the nomination of our party.
Political opponents of Vice President Hubert Humphrey complained the party unfairly shut them out of the delegate selection process.
There was a tremendous sense of betrayal by people on the left within the Democratic Party, and so they pushed through a series of rules that made primaries much more important in the selection of delegates and thus in the selection of Democratic nominees.
Republicans followed with similar changes of their own, and historians say the increased reliance on the primary system changed the landscape of presidential politics.
The smoke-filled room has been aired out and it's been replaced by a kind of Silicon Valley workspace filled with very smart number crunchers.
The last time a convention started without a clear nominee was 40 years ago at the Republican Convention in 1976.
West Virginia, 8 votes for Reagan, 20 votes for Ford.
Gerald Ford narrowly defeated Ronald Reagan, relying on uncommitted delegates who weren't obligated to vote based on the primary results. The conventions have been nearly as suspenseful over the past few decades, but they still serve important functions.
In addition to highlighting the presidential nominee, conventions provide a chance for the party to showcase its future talent, its up-and-coming rising stars.
Barack Obama! Like the state senator who first walked onto the national stage at the Democratic Convention in 2004.
There is not a black America, and a white America, and Latino America, and Asian America. There's the United States of America.
Clearly, the impact of the conventions can extend well beyond the selection of the presidential tickets.
You know what the outcome is going to be, but it's still a chance for the party to highlight and showcase their party, their message, their plans for the future in prime time in front of a much larger audience.
Don't think you're an investor? You make investments of money?
You have that other link. I go to this board. All right, let's skip this so we can just finish it. So now, Andrew Jackson. We're going to skip a couple of presidents, but get to Andrew Jackson. Oh, let's get ready this. So, and you thought modern politics is bad. Please don't read this. On February 9th, 1825, the United States House of Representatives elected John Quincy Adams to be the 6th President of the United States, after no candidate had received the majority of votes in the Electoral College. This was the first election in which the candidate who received the largest share of the popular vote did not become president. That's actually what happened with Bush in 2000, it happened in 1888, Bush in 2000, and then Trump in 16. You might not expect so decisive and confusing an election in a country that had only one real political party at the time. The Federalist Party had been in decline since the end of the war in 1812, and was in such a weak state that it had not even run a candidate against James Monroe in 1820. Monroe hoped that in the absence of a rival party, the Democratic Republican Party could unite Americans, perhaps bring an end to political parties entirely. He was wrong. In furtherance of that goal, he had brought several of his rivals and critics into his cabinet. But it's hard to maintain party discipline without an opposition party to unite it. By the time of the 1824 campaign, the Democratic Republican Party itself had begun to splinter. In this era, parties did not nominate candidates at national conventions. The Congressional Caucus, or King Caucus, of each party invented to nominate a candidate. When Monroe chose not to run for a third the time, the Congressional Democratic Republicans selected William H. Crawford as their nominee. Crawford had ample experience to recommend him. He had served as Ambassador to France, Secretary of War, and Secretary of Treasury. But the congressional nominating caucus had been sparsely attended, and there were those who thought that party leaders were forcing Crawford upon them. Crawford had also recently suffered a stroke, which left doubt about whether he would be well enough to get through an election, much less to serve as president. Various state legislatures and other groups of politicians nominated other candidates, and the nation wound up with 4 Democratic Republican candidates for the presidency. Crawford was joined in the race by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Senator Andrew Jackson, a hero of the War of 1812, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay, one of the nation's finest orators. Each candidate had strong support in a different region. Adams in the Northeast, Jackson in the South, Crawford in the Mid-Atlantic states, and Clay in the West. Jackson was the winner of the popular vote. In those states that had won, electors were still chosen by state legislators in 6 of 24 states, with about 41% of the votes to Adams' 31%. But Jackson's 99 electoral votes fell short of the 131 needed for a majority, and so the presidential race went to the House of Representatives. Under the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, when there is no electoral college majority, the House must choose from among the 3 candidates with the most electoral votes. Crawford barely defeated Clay for the 3rd position. Clay would not be elected, but he was left and with a great deal of influence with the House's choice. Even with Clay's support, Crawford would not have had the votes to win the election, and Clay intensely disliked Jackson. So Clay threw his support to Adams, and that was enough to give Adams a victory in the House. Rumors quickly spread that Clay had sold his support to Adams in exchange for a position in Adams' cabinet. Jackson was furious. He had won the largest share of the popular vote, and he won the electoral vote, but he had not won the presidency. And when Adams actually did make Clay the Secretary of State, Jackson and his supporters spent the next 4 years railing against this, quote, corrupt bargain, generating enough outrage that Jackson defeated Adams in the 1828 presidential election. And the other candidates, Crawford, well, okay, that's not important, but there we go. So that was in 1824, Andrew Jackson won the presidency. He won the popular vote, and he had the most electoral votes. But the House actually decides who president is in the event of a tie or nobody reaches a plurality. And therefore, they were able to subvert Jackson and put in John Quincy Adams. So here are the results. Jackson won 151,000 votes to Adams' 113. That's a huge percent. 11 points. I mean, the nation wanted Jackson. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. The nation wanted Jackson. 11 points is huge. So then we get to the election of 1828. Adams was not well liked, John Quincy that is, and Jackson beat him by 13%, which again is huge, which gave forth to the age of the common man. So Andrew Jackson becomes president finally in 1828, and he is a symbol of the Western temperament, that of that hardworking, saloon, bar, out liquor drinking, cursing, rough, self-made man. He was the first president not elected from a prominent colonial family. Washington, Adams, both Adamses, Jefferson, Monroe. He was a self-made man, a soldier, a politician, land speculator from the backcountry, fighter, lawyer, horse trader. He was a widower at 61. His wife died on December 22nd of 1828 of stress due to the campaign. I'll get more into that. I really break down Jefferson and Jackson on Tuesday, I believe. And so she and he were attacked viciously by the Quincy Adams campaign for their relationship. Again, I'll get into that. And the stress literally killed her. She died just before his inauguration, less than 3 months later. He was plagued by persistent cough and headaches. Back then, medicine was not the way it was. He probably didn't have totally fine back then, just plague was his problem. And again, he lost the 1824 presidential election, John Quincy in the House, and then as a result threatened to kill Adams. He literally said, if I ever see him, I will kill him. And Adams made sure to avoid him for the rest of his life. True story. So Jackson believed in simple duties of the president. He believed that men should serve a term in government and return to the status of private citizen. In other words, he kind of really symbolized the George Washington ideology of not being a professional politician. You kind of get in, you let your voice be heard, you fix those problems you need to fix it anyway. He believed that office holders who stayed too long grew corrupt. Do we agree with that? That office holders that are around for a long time are more corrupt? Yeah, I think that's a general philosophy. He believed that democracy is promoted by, or excuse me, at this time, democracy was promoted by party appointments by newly elected officials. And he relied very little on his cabinet and only had a small group of internal advisors, those people whom he trusted the most, that they were going to back him if he were going to really support, move forward. I'll get into this next week, but these foreign interstate projects, they meant taxing multiple states for, highways, basically. Highways in terms of cars, but Congress supported that. I apologize. It was very much like, oh, Indiana and Ohio, you want to build a road together? Fund it yourselves. Don't come to the federal government. Okay, so get us through. We'll finish this right here. So the growth of democracy. So political parties developed new types of politicking in this era to reach new voters. In the 1820s, political politicians, began using campaigns, parades, slogans, all of which to appeal to the masses, all things that we see today. When you see a politician, he's surrounded by thousands of people, colors, balloons, all that kind of stuff. They were well-organized statewide political machines, and these developed this time for the first time in history. Party loyalty was expected. Do we see that today? If you disagree with one thing of Republican or Democrat politician that's well-liked, are you not hated by even your own party? And partisan newspapers, boom. I like to show these icons here. Two of the three most popular, cable news sites, CNN news channels, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. They are just the television version of the newspaper. The newspapers were all partisan. The Arizona Republic today, does anybody know why they're called Republic? They started out as the Arizona Republican. They were a strictly Republican newspaper. That was the thing. It was just they were. So today we're like CNN, they're told to bias, Fox News are biased. Yeah, okay. That's kind of like how it's always been. People like to hear the news and get the information that they most agree with. By the 1830s, the democracy of the commoners became more expected than a republic of natural aristocrats. Positions of power became attainable for self-made men. Look at Andrew Jackson. He was proof of that. Americans valued equal opportunity among white men at that time, although not necessarily equality in terms of gender or skin color. That was coming. White males were seen as equal before the law and in voting. There were decreased requirements in licensed professionals. So if you wanted to become a professional, they were lowering the standards. Although even back then, those lowered standards were much higher than they might be today. There's no clear domestic servant class. There was a growing number of Americans who owned the land, so on and so forth. By the 1830s and 40s, the nation experienced massive voter turnout. I'll show you guys numbers here in a second. Due to the growth of suffrage, and in other words, specifically at this time, more men could vote than ever before, more white men could vote, and increased organization of political parties. So I like to use this example of an open door, a democracy, an open door as being an example of democracy. Today, we basically see the door wide open. There are very few people over the age of 18 who cannot vote, that they are for some reason prohibited from voting. Generally, it just means you're not a full citizen or you are a felon. And even both of those are kind of lowering in some states. So for the most part, the door in the United States, man or woman, regardless of skin color, everybody's allowed to participate. Which is now fairly common in the Western world, certainly in democratic countries. Back then, when the nation started, the United States started, the door was only open this wide. It was only open a crack. But contemplate the fact that the United States is the only democracy on planet Earth. In other words, the door, for as closed as it appears to us today, had never been opened so wide in human history. By the 1830s and 40s, I'll show you some numbers here in a second, the door had opened about this far, mostly white men at the time. And yet, it was the widest the voting door of democracy had ever been opened in all of human history. We then get to the Reconstruction Amendments, and black men are granted the right to vote. So population is about half men, half women. Half of the population, so long as you're over 18, half of the population of the United States could vote. The door had never been wider in human history. For as close as this appears to us today, it was as wide as the Grand Canyon is today. When women were granted the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, the door finally opened pretty much for everybody at the age of 18. The widest to this day it has still ever been in human history. Nowhere else in the world was the right to vote as widespread as it was in the United States, even though the door of democracy was only open this wide. From 1824 to 1840, democracy was extended to more Americans than any group of citizens in any country ever. Before 1840, most states limited the right to vote exclusively to property owners and taxpayers. Only 50% of white men had the right to vote. By 1840, restrictions were removed for most white men, with 90% of white men having the right to vote. The door had never been wider in human history. Now I want to show you this. By 1840, 80.2% of the voting public participated. It was only white men still, but 80.2% of white men voted. 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. Look at today. This past election, 2020, was a historic election. People loved Trump or hated Trump. It was enough to get so many more people out to vote than ever before. And by number, that's true. But by percentage, it still pales in comparison to the percentage of the voting public who did vote. In fact, it was in the 70s until 1900. By 1900, it started to slide. And you can see here, where is it? In 96, only 49% was 49% of voting age population in 1996 voted. Less than 50%. 2020, it is approximately 66.7%. Still much smaller in terms of percentage than it was back then. All right, so let me take attendance, but just so you guys see, the assignment is 3 questions. That's due next, not this coming Monday, but next Monday. You're going to compare and contrast Jefferson's democracy with Jackson's democracy. What are Jefferson and Jackson's respective backgrounds? Whom can each believe should participate in the democratic process and or hold public office? 2, explain 3 ways democracy changed or expanded from the time of Jefferson to the time of Jackson. And 3, identify one way democracy can be improved or to grow today, and how it can be done. Here's some additional sources for use. I will leave this up. If you have interest in this topic, I've got 3 books, 3 documentaries, 3 movies from what you can choose from. So I can't see it now, but those are there for you. If you want to learn more.
HBO series.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. All right, so that clock is a little behind. I was following that one. So I'll start with, I love you all. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, have fun. Let me know if you need anything. But then I'll also say, I generally dislike this. When I call your name, you can leave, especially if there's a rush. So Abigail, here. So please just be quiet as you're leaving, so everybody else can do. Andrew. No. Ashley. Berkeley. Blaine. Blake. Am I calling the right class? This is U.S. history. Brian.
Mine starts with an A.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll shoot. I'll take one. Adelina?
Here.
Okay. And Amber? No. Okay. So then Ashley, O. Avery. Berkeley. Blaine. Blake. Brian. Brooklyn. Camilla?
Here.
A lot of people are expecting. Carter?
Here.
Nice. Dawson? Lane? Here. Dawson Mitch? DeMarcus? Demetrius, Erica, Emily, Stephanie, Evan.
Here.
And then Frederick, Gabby.
Here.
Gabby, Haley, Hannah, Isabella, Jamie, Jamie.
Here.
Jesse, Joella, John C. John D. No Davis. Joseph, Julia, Kenna, Carissa, Kiami. Is that here? No, Kiami's here, okay. Laurel. Lori, Leslie, Mackenzie.
Here.
Mary. Here. Okay. Matthew. No, Matthew. Marilyn.
Here.
Marilyn. Michael. Michaela.
Here.
Morgan.
Here.
Nancy.
Here.
Nathan.
Here.
Okay. Nathaniel. Nick. Here. Okay. Lauren. Here. Peyton.
Here.
Raina. Samantha. Actually, what's your last name?
Ryan.
Right, okay. Is Samantha Murray here?
Here.
Okay, got there. Okay. Savannah. Seth. Here. Sydney. No. Sydney, Sophia.
Here.
Tanner. Here. Taylor. Tyler. Vanessa. No. So did I hear Tanner was yes? Yep. And Sophia was yes? Sophia, yes or no? I think so. Okay, I think so. Yeah. Hey, did I not call somebody? I got more. Did I not call you?
You did.
I did, okay. See you guys next week.
I have a question.
Yeah, I
I woke up at about 2 a.m. on Tuesday, realizing that I didn't turn in my thing, and I wanted to see if I could do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Huh?
How much time?
I just need to turn it in, it's done.
I
That
don't
end.
think it's closed, is it?
Oh,
Should I reopen it?
Oh, I
Try turning it in.
it just says overdue on the thing, and normally that just means that I can't turn it in. That and the,
Okay, try
first
turning
one
it
are the
in.
same thing for me right now.
Try turning it in. If it doesn't, shoot me a text.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I'll have a question. I have a question. I emailed you about I think sad about the participation.
Yeah.
I didn't know if my private form had gotten through. But also for participation, do you want it through email?